Welcome to You Are From God, where we open God's Word to discover His image in ourselves and the people around us. I'm Scott Taylor.
And I'm Tyler Hall. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome back. We're very thankful that you are tuned in and listening to us to share a few moments as we open our Bibles together and discover the image of God in ourselves and the people around us. Scott, it's good to be back with you. Today, we are talking about the value of time. And this is a topic that is obviously constantly something we should be mindful of, and it's very easy to lose track of. Time is one of those things about life that we can measure it, we can try to save it, we can waste it, spend it, all these different words we use to describe our relationship with time. But it's fascinating when you come to the scriptures. God clearly has a plan for us when it comes to how we view and use our time. But even just in some of the parables that Jesus tells, there's some interesting connections we can make to how we see this. In particular, Matthew 25 finds the parable of the servants and the talents that they're given by their master. But I've always found it interesting in most Bible translations when it brings up this monetary unit in verse 15 of a talent. At least in my translations, every ones that I've looked at, it'll give a little side note of explaining what a talent is, because we don't have that anymore. And when people read that, they think it's a skill or ability that I'm uniquely gifted with. Well, in this parable, it is a unit of money, and it's worth about 20 years' wages for a laborer. And I've always found that fascinating. First of all, that one coin or unit that you could pass around and hand out would be worth 20 years of somebody's life working for that. And this master, I mean, he's very wealthy because he gives to one servant 5 of these talents, to another he gives 2, and to another he gives 1. So he's got talents to distribute here. But I've been thinking about this from the standpoint of what those talents mean in terms of time. So you think about these 3 servants and those different amounts they're given, and instead of thinking about it from the standpoint of this is how much wealth they've been entrusted, you start thinking of it from the standpoint of time. So if 5 talents is 100 years of work. That's how much time it's worth in the sense of working and earning that money. And so what could somebody do with 100 years? And then you go to 2 talents, and okay, that's 40 years. What does somebody do with 40 years? And then you get to 1 talent, and again, as we've said, that's 20 years, which it's not as much as the others, but that's still a lot of time. 2 decades. What could you do with 2 decades? And it makes what happens in the story even more fascinating because as we read through the parable that 5-talent servant goes out, he invests and he trades and he makes 5 more. And then the 2-talent servant does the same. He makes 2 more. He doubles what he's been entrusted with. That 1-talent servant, though, in verse 18, he goes and he digs in the ground and hides his master's money. And there's this accounting that comes when the master returns. He proclaims, "Well done, good and faithful servant," to the first 2. And then you get to verse 24, and you get to the 1-talent servant, and he says, "Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours." But his master answered, "You wicked and slothful servant, you knew that I reap where I had not sown, and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to him who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has will be given more, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." There's obviously understanding here of what we need to do with the things that God has given us. In particular, for our conversation, what we do with the time God has given us. Scott, you and I have both known people who don't live long past the age of 20. Their lives are what we would say cut short, and they do amazing things with those 20 or so years of life. So how do we take this parable and really bring it home to our understanding of how we use the time that we can't make more of it? It's not like we're generating it on our own, but God entrusts us with an amount of time, and we don't even know. Are we a servant that gets 40 years? Or are we going to get 60 years? Do we get 100 years of life? And that amount seems smaller the more that it's spent. So how do we make sense of this from a time standpoint?
Well, I think it's really important how you started off with this, is that the value of time is something that we need to take time to think about. And to the point that you are making, we can waste it so quickly, especially in today's society when we are surrounded by things that take away our time, from watching goofy videos on YouTube or whatever the case may be. And that's the struggle that we can get caught up in so quickly. And next thing you know, a lot of time's gone by. So I think of James, the 4th chapter, and there's other verses I think will go with this, where it says in verse 13, "Come now, you who say today or tomorrow you will go to such and such a city and spend a year there and engage in business and make a profit, yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You are just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away." I think one of the things when you use the parable as the backdrop of this is really just understanding how blessed we are with every second that we've been given, instead of looking at it as though tomorrow is expected. It doesn't mean you don't plan for it. There's a difference between planning for something and expecting it to be here. There's a power for us, I think, in living in the moment. You certainly are making sure that the quality time that you are spending is on quality things rather than just focusing on quantity. And I think that's the point that you're trying to make. There's a lot of people that have lived shorter lives, cut short, that did a lot for the kingdom of God with the time that they had. And then there's others that may have lived longer, but the reality is it wasn't the quality. They may not even have worshiped God at all. But certainly we need to understand the value of that time to start off with when we're talking about comparing it to the talents, to the money that the parable does, and truly understanding what really and how valuable that time is.
Yeah, it's much like that parable. It's not the amount that's given, but how it is used. And you could have easily heard this story presented from the 5-talent servant goes and hides that money or puts that money aside and just gives back the 5, because that's a lot of money to risk losing it all. And the 1-talent servant could have gone out and traded and made 1 more talent, and that would have been the response for him. Well done, good and faithful servant. So it's not about the amount necessarily. It is about how we're using it, and using it, as you've referenced there, for God's glory. I made mention before that we don't know how much time God has entrusted us with, but God does. And that's where turning to Him, seeking Him every single day, using that time for His purposes and His will and His glory is the best possible use of that time. Psalm 139 is this beautiful psalm of David that basically explains how God knows us, He's made us, He has these plans for us, He is all-knowing and all-powerful in our lives, and He made us. And in verse 16, it's saying not just that He made our physical bodies, but He knows what's going to happen with us even before it does. Psalm 139 and verse 16 says, "Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them." And I mean, that concept alone is just wild. And this is where a lot of people say, well, if God knows what's going to happen, then do we really have a choice? God being outside of time and knowing what's going to transpire in our lives and the choices we will make doesn't mean that we don't have the choice to make in those moments. That doesn't take away our agency that God has blessed us with. Here, though, it is making it very powerfully so apparent that God knows that we have limited time, and He wants us to seek His will in that. He's got this book, as it's described, where our days are laid out, what we're going to be doing, what's going to come with those days. And so you find another psalm, Psalm 90 and verse 12, Moses saying, "Teach us to number our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom." It's not just enough to know, okay, I have limited time, or know that difficult things may come with that time, but I need to use my time in a wise way, taking that knowledge and applying it in such a way that's helping me to appreciate that there's a limitation, that I'm not going to be here forever, that I don't know when my life will come to an end. And so I need to use every moment that I am blessed with to trade, to invest, to use the parable language, to actually put that money, that valuable time to work for purposes bigger than just myself.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Back in Psalm 139, you and I both have talked about this recently in sermons, but it ends with this idea from Yes, he knows the time that we have here on earth, but he's leading us, or we're striving to be a part of this everlasting way, as he'll word it, at least in the New American Standard in verse 24. He says, "And see if there be any hurtful way in me, and lead me in the everlasting way." The time that we're given on this earth is finite. There certainly is an amount that we have, but it is going to play a big part in where we spend eternity from the standpoint of obedience, how we use that time, and whether or not we're taking the wonderful, amazing plan of salvation and the fact that Jesus died for me and living for that sacrifice that he offered for us. So the importance, as you just said, is the danger of thinking that we're always going to have tomorrow and not making the most of the time we have today living for God. And certainly that's the danger. There's a lot of times people can push it off, we'll do it next week. Well, the reality is, whether you like it or not, that is a very dangerous game to play, because we're not promised any more time than what we have right now. And that's a reality that sometimes we would rather just pretend like isn't true, but it is true. And we need to make sure that we are doing the things that are making the best use of our time, doing all we can to shine our lights for other people so that they also realize the value of this time.
Yeah, and that's really where you get the New Testament application of some of those Psalms. Obviously, Jesus teaches that parable, and we can make the time application, but just so we're very clear, Paul will be inspired by the Spirit of the Lord to write this down verbatim in Ephesians chapter 5, 15 and 16, about how we use our time. It says there, "Look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise." You see here another connection between wisdom and how we use time. Verse 16, though, "making the best use of the time, because the days are evil." Now, several translations will read that differently. I'm reading out of the English Standard Version, but you'll talk about redeeming the time, making the most of every opportunity. It's seeing the value in that time and buying it back for its full worth. So truly taking the time that I have and investing it, and investing myself in doing the things that God would have me do, growing in my faith and my knowledge of him, seeking to love and serve other people, and doing things that might be hard, but they're worth doing and spending the time and energy on. It's fascinating that he gives a reason here of we make the best use of the time because the days are evil. The passage of time brings challenges. It brings difficult. There's change involved, and not all of it is for the better in a very human perspective standpoint. You know, things happen, difficulties come and go. Age is certainly just a generic thing that we all go through that comes with the passage of time. It brings its own struggles and hardships. And so we see this. God's making it very clear the days are evil, but we have the opportunity to redeem that time, buy it back for what God intended it for, and truly just live in a way that is honoring our master. I keep coming back to this parable because I think about it from that relationship with time. We think we control time so much, but really, God's put a certain amount of time in our hands, and it's his time that he's allowed us to live and to move and have our being. And so we get to choose how we're going to use it. We have to make the determination to be faithful caretakers and stewards of that time, to earn that time back for him, to return that value and that investment to the God who made us, who gave us that time to begin with. And it's just such a powerful perspective to have, especially when it comes to being worried about time, whether it's things in the past that I can't change, or getting anxious about what's going to happen in the future. What's going to happen with this one talent if, I do this or don't do that? And we end up being like that one talent servant who buries it in the ground, and we just float through life. Time happens to us. Time uses us instead of us using the time.
I think the most amazing lesson I've learned as a preacher is when you sit at somebody's deathbed and you listen to them talk about their life. And you understand, first of all, you understand the value of time at that moment for sure, but you also understand that we waste a lot of that time on things at the time we may have thought were important. But at the end, it's normally about spending time with family. It's normally about this quality time that we're talking about in worship of God. And that's amazing to me, because why is that always the end result of what people will say when we can live it now? Mm-hmm. And so the living need to take it to heart, as Ecclesiastes will say, and make sure that we're doing the things now that are making the most of the time that God has given us. And that's such an important lesson for me. I think it's an important lesson for all of us, because there is no question that we are so blessed by him. There's no question that there is a debt that we had that he alone could pay. And he's given us so many things that so often we take for granted and not realize it is just an amazing thing to say that we are from God. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this program. Be sure to subscribe on your platform of choice so you never miss an episode.
Would you do us a favor and recommend this program to someone you know? We pray this simple act of sharing can encourage both of you in the faith and open up doors for meaningful and Christ-centered conversation. You can find us at youarefromgod.com. Click the connect button at the top of the page if you'd like to send us a question, give us feedback, or offer a suggestion for an episode. Catch up on previous episodes, find the year-long devotional, and more by visiting youarefromgod.com.